I declare the 10th emergency session, the 10th emergency special session of the General Assembly resumed. Members will recall that in paragraph 14 of its resolution ES 10/21 of 27th October 2023, the Assembly decided to adjourn the 10th emergency special session temporarily and to authorize the President of the General Assembly at its most recent session to resume its meeting upon request from member states. In this regard, I should like to draw the attention of delegations to document A/ES 10/974, which contains a letter dated 8th December 2023 from the permanent representatives of Egypt and Mauritania to the United Nations in their respective capacities as chair of the Arab Group and Organization for Islamic Cooperation Group, requesting the resumption of the 10th emergency special session of the General Assembly. I intend to conduct the proceedings of this meeting in accordance with the rules of procedure of the General Assembly and the past practices of its emergency special sessions. The General Assembly will now resume its consideration of Agenda Item 5, entitled Illegal Israeli Actions in Occupied East Jerusalem and the Rest of the Occupied Palestinian Territory. In this connection, the Assembly has before it draft resolution in document A/ES 10/L27 and draft amendments A/ES 10/L28 and A/ES 10/L29. The President will now deliver a statement. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, this past week, it was with a very heavy heart that I read the letter addressed to me by UNRWA Commissioner General Philip Lazzarini. That letter, on which many of your missions were also copied, highlighted the devastating deterioration of the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. As Commissioner General Lazzarini himself predicted in his letter, the situation has since deteriorated further. Right now, what we are seeing is an onslaught on civilians, the breakdown of humanitarian systems, and profound disrespect for both international law and international humanitarian law. As I said before, even war has rules, and it is imperative that we prevent any deviation from these principles and values, the validity of which resides in their universal application. Tens of thousands have been killed, almost 70% of them women and children. Even more have been forcibly displaced by the incessant violence, with nowhere, I repeat, nowhere safe to go. And the targeting of hospitals, schools, and UN-provided shelters, now so overcrowded that they have ceased to function as safe havens, continues unabated. All the while, the blockade on humanitarian assistance has made the delivery of urgently needed life-saving aid near impossible. Excellencies, clearly, what we are witnessing is the unprecedented collapse of an already crumbling humanitarian system in real time. It is incumbent upon us, as the United Nations, to bring an immediate end to the suffering of innocent civilians, the mounting death toll of those who are not, I repeat, are not combatants in this war, and to this untenable humanitarian catastrophe. Thanks to several countries' relentless efforts, a temporary humanitarian truce enabled the release of hostages, the freeing of detainees, and the delivery of some aid. However, since the 1st of December, we are witnessing the resumption of violence with a kind of ferocity that one asks, what more next? Civilians should never undergo the level of suffering we are currently witnessing. And again, I ask, how many more thousands of lives must be lost before we do something? No more time is left. The carnage must stop. For as long as this violence persists, a political solution to this conflict will continue to be undermined. The longer it takes, the higher the risk that a negotiated two-state solution will increasingly become out of reach. So the fact of the matter is, quite simply, the violence must stop. It must. I therefore once again add my voice to the demand of for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. We have one singular priority, only one: to save lives. Excellencies, casting our gaze towards the future, we must assess the situation with honesty in our hearts, truth in our words, and a commitment to peace as our utmost ambition. A ceasefire is the only realistic first step towards de-escalating tensions. How can we possibly listen to each other over the deafening thundering of bombs? On 26th October, you gathered in this chamber with the membership resoundingly and unequivocally calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. On December 7th, once more, a veto was cast in the Security Council. Once again, this emergency special session has been resumed. We certainly cannot continue in this way without even the possibility, let alone the prospect, for a meaningful solution. As President of the General Assembly, I am committed to supporting any and all efforts to put an end to the bloodshed and the psychological torture of the people in Gaza. I used my recent attendance at the Doha Forum and every other platform I can to encourage cooperation among states with the same singular goal in mind: to make peace for all. In the name of humanity, I ask you all once again, stop this violence now. I thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt to introduce draft resolution A/ES 10/L27.
سيد الرئيس،
Mr.
أشكركم بالنيابة عن
I thank
المجموعة
you on
العربية
behalf of the
على
Arab
سرعة
group
الاستجابة
for quickly
لعقد
heeding
هذا
our
الاجتماع
call to hold this
بناء على
meeting.
طلب المجموعتين العربية والإسلامية
The call
في
from the Arab
محاولة
and Islamic
لتجاوز ما
groups in
شهده
an
العالم من
attempt to
عرقلة
overcome the
لمحاولات
obstruction
مجلس الأمن تحمل
of the Security
مسؤولياته
Council's attempts
عبر
to shoulder
المطالبة
its
بإنفاذ
responsibilities by
وقف
calling
إنساني
for an
فوري لإطلاق
immediate
النار بالأراضي
humanitarian
الفلسطينية المحتلة.
ceasefire in the occupied
وما
Palestinian
شهدناه جميعا
territory.
من استخدام جائر لحق النقد
There was an
بمشروع قرار
extensive
لوقف
use
إطلاق النار
of the
الإنساني
veto against the humanitarian
بعد أن حاز
ceasefire
على دعم
draft
أكثر من
resolution,
100
even
عضو
though it
بالأمم
was
المتحدة
supported by more than
في ظرف
100
ساعات
member states
معدودة،
within a few
مما
hours of
يعد
the United
مؤشرا
Nations.
على إدراك
This is a
الغالبية
sign
العظمى
that the
من
majority
المجتمع
of the
الدولي
international
لخطورة
community is well
وجسامة
aware
الوضع
of the
الراهن
seriousness of the current
وانعكاساته
situation and
الكارثية
its
على السلم والأمن
repercussions,
الدوليين.
its tragic repercussions on
سيد
international
الرئيس،
peace and security.
مشروع
Mr.
القرار
President,
المقدم
the draft
المرفوع للجمعية
resolution
العامة
tabled
اليوم
today
A/ES/10/L27 بسيط المضمون
is very simple,
واضح الأركان
clear,
صريح الغرض
and explicit.
ويقع في
It
4
only
فقرات عاملة
includes
فقط،
4 operative paragraphs.
إلا أن إنفاذ ما ورد بهذه الفقرات
implementation
أعجز
of
المجتمع
these
الدولي
paragraphs
لمدة جاوزت الشهرين
has yet to happen
رغم
by the
وضوح الوضع
international
الإنساني
community for 2
الكارثي
months.
الذي يعانيه
Even though
أشقاؤنا
the tragic
الفلسطينيون
humanitarian situation
وسط الهجمات البربرية
for the
التي تشنها
Palestinians.
قوات
They
الاحتلال
are
الإسرائيلي ضد
subjected to
المدنيين في
barbaric
غزة
attacks by
التي أفضت
Israeli
إلى
occupation
معاناة
forces
إنسانية
against
تجاوزت كل
civilians in
الحدود
Gaza. This has led to
وتهديدا
an
جديا
unbearable
للسلم
humanitarian
والأمن
suffering.
الدوليين.
It has threatened international
دفع
peace and
السكرتير عام الأمم
security. This
المتحدة
is why the Secretary General of
ولأول
the
مرة
United
منذ
Nations,
توليه منصبه
for the first time
ومنذ
since he
عدة
took
عقود
office and for several
إلى
decades,
مخاطبة مجلس الأمن إنفاذا
decided to
للمادة
invoke Article
99
99
من
of the
ميثاق
UN
الأمم
Charter
المتحدة للمطالبة
to
بما
call
يطالب به مشروع
specifically for
القرار
what this draft resolution is calling for,
وقف إطلاق نار
namely a
إنساني
humanitarian
بسبب
ceasefire.
ما نتج عن هذا العدوان من انهيار
Because the Israeli
للنظام الصحي
aggression
والمخاوف من
destroyed
قرب
the
انهيار
health
النظام
system.
العام ونظام
There are
الدعم
concerns
الإنساني في
of
غزة
a demise of the public order
واستحالة
and the
إدارة العمليات
humanitarian
الإنسانية
support system in Gaza.
هناك.
It is
وهو ما دفع
impossible to
أيضاً
provide humanitarian
المفوض
assistance
العام
there, and this
لوكالة
is why
الأونروا
the Commissioner General of
لتوجيه خطاب
UNRWA
لكم سيد الرئيس
spoke to you and sent
لتسليط
you a
الضوء على
letter
الوضع الإنساني المتدهور في
to shed
قطاع
light on the
غزة
deteriorating humanitarian
وخطورته
situation
على
in
قدرة
Gaza
الأونروا على الوفاء
and its
بمهامها
impact on UNRWA's capacity to
ناهيك عن
shoulder its
خطورته على
mandate
سلامة وأمن موظفي
and how it
الوكالة.
affects the safety and security
سيد
of
الرئيس،
UNRWA staff. Mr. President,
تؤكد المجموعة
The
العربية
Arab group stresses
أن مساعي أقلية
that
من
the
الدول
efforts
الرامية
by a
للتصدي للرأي العام
minority of
الدولي
states that are
المطالب
standing
بوقف إطلاق
against
النار
international public opinion, which is
لذرائع
calling for a
ومبررات
ceasefire,
واهية
are
متعلقة
using
بحق إسرائيل في الدفاع عن
void
نفسها
pretexts and justifications
تتجاهل عن
in saying
عمد
that Israel has the right to defend
أن هذا
itself.
الحق لا ينطبق على إسرائيل
This
في
is a
احتلالها
deliberate
للأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة
sign.
باعتبارها قوة
And
الاحتلال
we would
غير
like to say that
الشرعي.
this right does not apply to
وتتجاهل
Israel
أيضا
because
أن
it is
هذا
the
الحق لا
occupying power.
يعفي حال
It's
تطبيقه من
occupying the
الالتزام
occupied
بأبسط قيم
Palestinian
الإنسانية
territories.
ومبادئ القانون
And this
الدولي
right does not absolve
وقواعد
Israel
القانون
from
الدولي
committing to
الآمرة
the
التي
implementation of
تقي النساء
international
والأطفال
law
والمدنيين العزل
and
وسط
protecting
الحروب.
innocent civilians,
إن تلك
women, and
المساعي
children during
المؤسفة
wars.
تمثل
These
صورة
tragic
مقيتة
attempts are a
من صور ازدواجية
despicable
المعايير
sign of double standards.
والتي نجد فيها بعض الدول تطالب
Some countries
العدوان
are calling for stopping the aggression, stopping the
والاحتلال
war, stopping the
والهجوم
occupation,
على
and stopping
المدنيين
attacks on civilians,
وتطالب باحترام
and for
القانون الدولي
respecting the
والقانون
international
الدولي
humanitarian law
الإنساني
and
في
international
حالات
law in specific cases.
ولكنها
However,
للأسف وبشكل
and
محزن
unfortunately
تدير
and
ظهرها
shamelessly,
لهذه
they
المطالبات
turn
في
their
حالات
back to these
أخرى
calls in other situations,
خاصة عندما تتعلق
especially
بالإنسان
when they're
الفلسطيني
related to Palestinians
وحقه
and their
للعيش
right to
بأمان على
live in
أرضه
security
وفي
on their
دولته
territory,
المستقلة
in their
ووقف جرائم
independent
الحرب
state,
التي
to
ترتكب
stop the
ضده
war crimes
بلا هوى.
against Palestinians.
سيد الرئيس السادة
Mr.
الأعضاء
President, ladies
إن
and
اعتماد
gentlemen,
ثم إنفاذ
the
مشروع
adoption
القرار
and the
قيد نظر الجمعية
implementation of
العامة
the
اليوم
draft resolution
وفي
by the
قلبه
General Assembly
المطالبة بوقف
today,
إطلاق
which is
النار هو
specifically
وحده
calling for a ceasefire, is
الكفيل
the
بإنقاذ
only
أرواح الأبرياء
guarantee for saving
إذ تتناول
innocent
الفقرة
civilians.
الديباجية السادسة للمشروع بكل
Paragraph
توازن
6 of the
وحياد
preamble
على
is
عكس ما قد
very
يدعيه
balanced
البعض
and neutral.
ضرورة
Despite what some
حماية
might claim,
المدنيين من
it stresses the
الجانبين
need for protecting
وفقاً
civilians from
للقانون
both
الدولي
sides in
الإنساني.
line with the international humanitarian law.
كما يطالب المشروع في فقراته العاملة الأطراف
The draft
كافة
resolution
الأطراف
is calling
بالامتثال
in its
للالتزام بحماية
operative
المدنيين
paragraphs upon all
ويطالب
parties
كذلك
to
بإطلاق
commit
سراح
to
كافة
the
الرهائن
protection of
وضمان
civilians
النفاذ
and the
الإنساني.
release of all hostages
سيد الرئيس إن
and to
استمرار
ensure
هذه الحرب
humanitarian
المدمرة
access.
سيؤدي
Mr.
إلى
President,
كارثة متكاملة الأركان
the perpetration of this
ويعني
destructive
بكل
war will
الأسف
lead to a
الإذعان
full-fledged
لتكتيكات
catastrophe.
الإبادة الجماعية
This
كأداة
will
من أدوات
unfortunately
الحرب
mean that genocide
بما
will
يهدم
be
كل
used
قواعد
as
القانون الدولي
a tool
الآمرة
for war.
ويجر المنطقة
Completely disregarding
بأسرها إلى أتون
international
حرب
law. This
إقليمية
will lead the region
وقد يعصف بما
to a
تبقى من
full-fledged
مصداقية
war,
هذه
and it will
المنظمة
jeopardize
الدولية.
the credibility of this
سيد
international
الرئيس
organization.
تناشد
Mr.
المجموعة العربية
President,
كافة الدول
the
الأعضاء
Arab group calls upon
دعم
all
مشروع
member
القرار
states to
المطروح
support the draft
أمامكم
resolution before you
تطبيقا
today,
للكيل بمكيال واحد وحفاظا على
to
القيم
prevent any double
الإنسانية
standards and to
ودعما
protect
للمصلحة
international
المشتركة
values, to
لكافة أطراف
support
المجتمع الدولي في الحفاظ على السلم والأمن
collective
الدولي
interests, and to protect
كما
international
تدعو
peace
المجموعة
and
العربية
security.
كافة
We also
الوفود
call upon
إلى
all
التصويت ضد
delegations
أي
to vote
تعديلات مقدمة على
against
هذا
any
المشروع
amendments proposed
التي لم يتم التشاور
because they
بشأنها
were
مع
not
الدول الراعية
discussed with the
للقرار
sponsor countries.
وذلك حرصا بشكل أساسي على الحفاظ على
This
نصه
is
المتوازن
To
والمباشر
protect the
الذي تم
balance of the
صياغته
text.
لتتطابق
The
بنوده مع
text
بنود
was
مشروع
drafted
القرار الذي
so as
طرح
to
على
go in
مجلس
line
الأمن
with the draft resolution tabled
تحقيقا
at the
لأولوية
Security
لا
Council
تعلوها
to
أولوية
achieve the
أخرى أيا
main
كان
priority, the number one
لهدف
priority,
واضح وصريح
a
ومحدد
very clear and
وقف
specific
إطلاق النار
objective,
الإنساني
namely a
حرصا على عدم
humanitarian
خلط الأوراق من
ceasefire.
جانب الوفود
Let
التي
us
تقدمت
not
بتلك
confuse
التعديلات
things,
بعد أن صوتت
because
نفس
some
تلك الوفود
delegations
ضد
have
قرار
proposed
الجمعية العامة
amendments, whereas they voted against
الذي
the
اعتمد في
draft
شهر
resolution
أكتوبر
at the
الماضي
General Assembly that
في
was
نفس تلك
adopted
الدورة
last year.
الطريقة المستأنفة
In
وتضمن
this
المطالبة
emergency special
بهدنة إنسانية
session, which
تفضي
called for a
إلى وقف العمليات العدائية
humanitarian pause that will
وهو ما
eventually lead to a
يفضح الغرض
cessation of
الحقيقي
hostilities.
وراء تلك التعديلات
This
للأسف
unveils the
استمرار
true
العدوان
objective
ونزيف دماء
behind
الأبرياء
these amendments, namely the
سيد الرئيس
continuation of the
السادة الأعضاء
aggression and the bloodshed. Mr. President, ladies
ماذا
and
ننتظر
gentlemen,
جميعا حتى
what are
نخمد
we all
هذه
waiting
النار؟
for to stop this fire?
ماذا ننتظر
What
حتى
are we
ننهي
waiting
هذه
for to
الحرب التي لا منتصر
this
فيها؟
zero-sum war?
ماذا ننتظر
What
حتى
are we
نوقف
waiting
القتل
for to stop the
ونخمد
killing
آلة الدمار؟
and stop the
بل
destructive
هل
war
نستطيع
machine?
الانتظار أصلا بعد أن تخطى عدد القتلى من
Can we even
المدنيين
wait
أكثر
when
من
the number of
18,000
civilians killed
شهيد
has gone beyond 18,000, including more than 7,000
بمعدل
children,
يبلغ مقتل طفل كل 10
with
دقائق
one child dying every 10
بالإضافة إلى
minutes?
عدد
And when the number of the
جرحى
injured has
جاوز
exceeded
بينما نتحدث 49,000 جريح
49,000 people,
سادة الأعضاء أخاطب ضمائركم
Excellencies,
جميعا
I am speaking to you, to your
وأناشدكم
conscience
مساندة
today.
مشروع
I am calling upon you
لوقف
to
نزيف
support the
الدماء
draft resolution
كل الدماء.
to stop the
The word on
bloodshed.
the procedure, Honorable President, I sincerely ask you, Mr. President, to suspend the debate following the introductions to proceed to take action on the draft resolution A/ES/10/L25 without delay, given the urgency of the situation on the ground and the importance of a global call for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, with the understanding that the debate would resume immediately after action and the adoption of the resolution, and that emergency session 10 would only be temporarily adjourned after the conclusion of the debate. And I do thank you, Mr. President. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Egypt. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Austria to introduce Amendment A/ES10/L28.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, colleagues, and friends, I have the honor to introduce to you draft amendment L28 proposed by Austria on resolution L27 entitled Protection of Civilians and Upholding Legal and Humanitarian Obligations. We meet today in this emergency special session to address the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. Austria is deeply concerned by the escalation following the heinous terrorist attacks by Hamas on Israeli civilians on 7 October. As our President stressed earlier, Austria has also continuously underlined the importance of ensuring the protection of all civilians at all times. Every civilian death is one too many. We have also called on more humanitarian aid to reach those in need and have increased our own contributions to humanitarian organizations. We very much welcome the humanitarian pauses and corridors that enable the release of some hostages and the provisions of urgently needed humanitarian aid. The recent escalation of violence started with Hamas' brutal, indiscriminate terrorist attacks across Israel on 7 October, and this deserves to be condemned in the strongest possible terms. As any state that suffers such an attack, Israel also has the right to defend its citizens in line with international law and international humanitarian law, and will therefore also support the amendment introduced by the United States. Austria has thoroughly considered the draft resolution before us today. We recognize the efforts by the Arab group to present a short and concise text, and we welcome that this text, in comparison to the resolution presented in October, explicitly demands the release of all hostages and also demands humanitarian access. However, this resolution falls short in many ways, including the right of Israel to ensure its citizens are safe and in naming the terrorist group responsible for the taking of hostages. The innocent children, women, and men held captive in Gaza have not simply disappeared or lost their way. They were abducted by Hamas. We can't just ignore this fact. The reports of those freed clearly show Hamas' brutality and complete disregard for human dignity. It's with this purpose that Austria presented a short, constructive amendment that's based on agreed language from UN Security Council Resolution 2712, adopted on 15 November of this year. This resolution called for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and other groups, and ensuring immediate humanitarian access. This is the exact language that our amendment that we are proposing today proposes to add. We are here today because there was another veto in the UN Security Council. And just a few weeks ago, the Security Council was able to name Hamas in a resolution that was adopted. The UN General Assembly should also have the courage to do the same. We therefore ask all of you to support the amendment we have put before you and vote yes. If that amendment passes, Austria will be able to join others in abstaining on the whole text. We will also continue working with all partners to ensure safety and security for Israelis and Palestinians alike. All of them, Palestinians, Israelis, deserve a peaceful future and the restoration of a political process leading to a two-state solution. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Austria. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States to introduce the draft amendment in A/ES10/L29. You have the floor, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, the last 2 months have been nothing short of devastating. Devastating for Palestinians who have lost their homes and their loved ones because of a conflict that Hamas set into motion. Devastating for Israelis who still face a barrage of rocket fire even as they continue to reel from Hamas's barbaric attacks on October 7th. Devastating for Jewish and Muslim people around the world who are targeted by rising levels of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And devastating for all those who dream of a sustainable peace in which Israelis and Palestinians enjoy equal measures of security, dignity, and freedom. That sustainable peace is what the United States wants to work towards. And that is what I believe so many members of this body want to work towards too. And indeed, there are aspects of this resolution that we do support. We agree that the humanitarian situation in Gaza is dire and requires urgent and sustained attention, that civilians desperately need food and water and shelter and medical care, that a devastating number of innocent people have been killed, and that civilians must be protected, consistent with international humanitarian law. In addition, we support the release of all hostages immediately and unconditionally. Roughly half of those kidnapped on October 7th remain in Gaza. That's over 100 people, subject to, as a number of released hostages have described, hell. And so we encourage you to vote yes on the amendment proposed by Austria, which, like the resolution passed in the Security Council on November 15th, call for Hamas and other groups to release the hostages and to provide humanitarian access to them immediately. Again, we support components of the resolution proposed today. But here's what else we support. We support speaking out with one voice to condemn Hamas for its terrorist actions on October 7th. Why is that so hard? To say unequivocally that murdering babies and gunning down parents in front of their children is horrific, that burning down houses while families shelter inside and taking civilians hostage is abhorrent. It's why today the United States is proposing an amendment that unequivocally rejects and condemns these atrocities. And we urge all members to vote yes and declare that what happened on October 7th is intolerable, period. This is the bare minimum, and it should not be that difficult. In addition, the United States supports immediately addressing the reports of horrific sexual violence unleashed by Hamas on and after October 7th. Over the last 20 years, the UN has repeatedly underscored the need to investigate all reports of conflict-related sexual violence. It's long past time every member apply that same standard to the assaults committed by Hamas. The United States also supports the ICRC having access to hostages to provide medical treatment. We support a resumption of humanitarian pauses, which could happen immediately if Hamas only agreed to release women, wounded, and civilian hostages. We have seen how critical these pauses are to get the hostages out and to give some respite to civilians and humanitarians in Gaza. Look, there's no shortage of rhetoric here in New York, but it's the diplomacy the United States is engaging in on the ground that made that week-long pause possible. It was careful conversation and collaboration with Egypt and Qatar that helped reunite more than 100 hostages with their loved ones, and that dramatically expanded humanitarian assistance to Gaza during the break in fighting. Of course, we support even more aid getting into the hands of those who so urgently need it. Over the last week and a half, the United States has airlifted more than 90,000 pounds of humanitarian aid to Egypt's border, with more on the way. And we're working with Israel, Egypt, the UN, and others to surge humanitarian assistance into Gaza. Israel's decision to open Kerem Shalom for inspections and screening of those humanitarian goods is essential and something we have been working toward in earnest. And Israel's commitment to ensure there's enough fuel to sustain the humanitarian assistance operation, including civilian infrastructure, is also vital. We've made clear to Israel we expect it to honor these commitments, and we will hold them to it. Colleagues, there's more we support. We support a more robust deconfliction mechanism to help protect UN and humanitarian personnel, far too many of whom have lost their lives while heroically working to save innocent people in Gaza. We support affirming that Israel, like every single country on earth, has the right and the responsibility to defend its people from acts of terrorism. Because we know that Hamas intends to repeat the horrors of October 7th again and again and again. A senior Hamas official said so himself on television. Indeed, it was Hamas that broke the 7-day pause last month by committing a vicious terror attack in Jerusalem, firing rockets into Israel, and then failing to release the hostages it had pledged to release. Let's be realistic here. This is a terrorist group that no member state would tolerate living next to. So long as Hamas remains driven by its murderous ideology, any ceasefire right now would be temporary at the best and dangerous at worst. Dangerous to Israelis, who would be subject to relentless attacks, and also dangerous to Palestinians, who deserve the chance to build a better future for themselves, free from Hamas, a group that hides behind innocent civilians rather than protect them, and that co-opts civilian infrastructure to wage conflict. Of course, how Israel defends itself matters. Israel must avoid mass displacement of civilians in the south of Gaza. It must ensure sufficient humanitarian assistance to those who have fled violence, and it must allow civilians in Gaza to return home as soon as conditions allow. We will continue to press at the highest levels for this and for the protection of civilians as Israel pursues legitimate military objectives. Because perhaps most of all, while we cannot support a one-sided Security Council or General Assembly resolution that ignores so much of what we all stand for, we desperately want to see an end to the cycle of unceasing violence. Colleagues, our goal must be to stop the death, the devastation, and the destruction for the long term. And that is simply not a future Hamas wants to see. So as we address this immediate crisis and work to surge humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people, we must also work to build a foundation for a truly sustainable peace, one where Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side in states of their own, so that the next generation and the generations to come need not experience the devastation of the last 2 months and finally realize freedom, security, and peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of the United States. The representative of Egypt has moved that the debate on agenda item 5 be suspended at this stage for the Assembly to proceed to the consideration of draft resolution AES-10 L27, and that the debate would continue after the action on the draft resolution. It is my understanding that, without setting a precedent and given the urgency of the issue, if the Assembly were to decide to suspend the debate at this stage for the Assembly to proceed to the consideration of draft resolution A/ES10/L27 and to continue the debate after the action on the draft resolution, and if the Assembly were to adopt the draft resolution subsequently, the 10th emergency special session would be adjourned temporarily following the conclusion of the debate on item 5. Is there any objection to the motion? I see none. It is so decided. Since there is, the Assembly shall now proceed to consider the draft resolution A/ES10/L27 and draft amendments A/ES10/L28 and A/ES10/L29. For your information, the draft resolution and draft amendments have closed for e-sponsorship. I now give the floor to the representative of the Secretariat.